Today, we're venturing into some really fascinating territory, how we even come to understand ourselves. Specifically when it comes to gender and sexuality.
Yeah, it's pretty deep stuff.
We've got writings from some really pivotal thinkers, Kristeva, Foucault, and Wittig, and then Judith Butler's incredibly insightful critiques and perspectives layered on top.
So think of this as our attempt to grapple with these big ideas, these sometimes dense philosophical ideas, but in a way that's clear and hopefully engaging.
Exactly. Our mission, if you will, is to unpack all this and reveal some maybe surprising insights into how we think about ourselves, about others.
And maybe challenge some assumptions about what feels natural, right? Because
Yeah.
that's a big theme here.
Definitely. Okay, so let's jump right in. Julia Kristeva and her concept of the abject sounds a bit intense, maybe?
It does, but it's really fundamental for her. At its core, the abject is about how we establish the boundaries of the I. It's the process of, like, pushing out or expelling what we see as other.
Like bodily waste, that's the classic example.
Exactly. Things that are part of us but have to be expelled for us to be, well, us. It's about defining where I begin and end by saying what I am not. What does that need tell us?
Okay, drawing a line, this is not me. And some thinkers, like Iris Marion Young, who Butler engages with, take this idea into the social world, don't they?
They do. Young extends objection to understand how we create social identities, sex, sexuality, race. The argument is that this expulsion, this kind of social repulsion, is key to creating dominant identities.
Hegemonic identities, the ones considered the norm.
Precisely. By defining who or what is out, you solidify who's considered in. It's a powerful mechanism.
So exclusion is central to building identity. Now, Kristeva also talks about the symbolic and the semiotic. These sound pretty academic.
They are key terms for sure. Think of the symbolic as the world of language, law, order. It's structured, rational. Kristeva connects it to what Lacan called the paternal function or paternal law. It aims for clear, single meanings, a unified self.
Right. Structure, clarity, rules, and the semiotic is the opposite, more chaotic.
Not chaotic exactly, but definitely different. It's like this other current within language. It carries traces of that really early pre-language connection with the maternal body, that feeling of fluidity, what she calls libidinal multiplicity.
Okay, so where does that surface?
It surfaces in things like poetic language, through rhythm, sound play, puns, things that disrupt those neat univocal meanings of the symbolic. It's where language gets a bit more slippery, maybe, unruly.
So poetry becomes this interesting space for challenging the rules. She calls this semiotic subversion, I think.
That's the term, yeah. It's the eruption, the breaking through of this repressed semiotic dimension into the symbolic via poetic language. It offers these, like, localized challenges or displacements of that dominant paternal law.
Yeah, that sounds like a potential way to resist rigid structures,
Yeah.
right, from within language itself. But the sources we looked at also flag some limitations.
And that's a crucial point. How truly subversive can this be? One critique is that, for Kristeva, this semiotic challenge is still kind of tethered to the paternal law it's trying to disrupt. It doesn't fully break free.
And it relies on this idea of a pre-cultural maternal body.
Which itself has been critiqued, yeah. Is there really something before culture like that? And is this kind of poetic disruption a realizable cultural practice for widespread change? Or is it more contained? What do you think?
It does make you wonder if it's more like a safety valve than a real engine for transformation. And then there's Butler's really pointed critique regarding Kristeva's view on homosexuality.
This is really significant. Butler argues Kristeva essentially pathologizes female homosexuality, suggesting it's like verging on psychosis because it represents such a radical break from the symbolic, the paternal law.
Which seems problematic.
Extremely. Butler contends that this framing actually ends up reinforcing heterosexual norms. By linking lesbianism to this potential loss of ego or symbolic coherence, Kristeva, according to Butler, inadvertently props up heterosexuality as the standard, the only way to be truly intelligible within culture. It really makes you question whose experience is centered, doesn't it?
Absolutely. A critical lens to keep in mind.
Okay.
Okay, let's pivot now. Michel Foucault. His ideas about how sex and gender are discursively constructed. This feels like a big shift.
It really is. Foucault fundamentally questions the idea that there's a stable biological sex that exists before discourse, before culture and history get involved.
So sex itself isn't just a natural fact.
Not for Foucault. He argues it's a historical and discursive construct, something produced by power relations, particularly as a way to regulate sexuality. The very concept of sex, the binary, has a history, a genealogy. It serves a purpose.
So the body isn't neutral ground. It's shaped, written on. The sources call it an inscribed surface of events. That's such a striking phrase.
It really is, and it connects to Foucault's idea of productive power. Power isn't just about saying no, repressing desires. It actively produces subjects, identities, categories.
It doesn't just forbid, it shapes who we are allowed to be or how we understand ourselves.
Exactly. Think about how institutions, medicine, law, psychiatry define and categorize people based on sex and sexuality. That's productive power at work.
And this leads to an interesting distinction in how gender is formed incorporation versus internalization. Can you unpack that?
Yeah, Foucault, and Butler picks this up strongly too, argues that gender isn't just something we internalize mentally, like adopting beliefs. It's incorporated, it gets literally built into our bodies through repeated practices.
How we move, speak, dress.
Right, all those things. Gender becomes inscribed on and through the body via these repeated actions, gestures, and how society reads them. It's embodied, not just ideological.
Okay. Now, Foucault apparently found drag potentially subversive. Why? What did he see in it?
Well, drag is fascinating because it deliberately plays with the signs of gender. It highlights the gap between, say, anatomical sex, the gender someone identifies with, and the gender they perform.
It separates things we often assume go together naturally.
Precisely. By messing with those connections, drag reveals the imitative quality, the constructedness, the contingency of all gender. It shows that the link between sex and gender isn't necessary or natural, it's culturally enforced. It makes you ask, well, if you can perform it so overtly, how fixed is it?
So gender becomes less an inner truth and more
Mm-hmm.
a style. Foucault talks about a corporeal style or stylistics of existence.
Yeah, something intentional, performative, a way of crafting meaning through the body, through actions. And the story of Hercule Barbin is often brought up here.
Right. The intersex person who's assigned sex was changed legally and medically. How does that illustrate Foucault's points?
Hercule's life vividly shows the power of discourse legal, medical to construct sex. The intense debate and eventual decision about Hercule's true sex demonstrates how these categories aren't just found, they're actively made and enforced.
A real-world example of sex being constructed.
Definitely. But it's also worth noting, Foucault initially kind of romanticized Hercule's non-identity, this idea of happily existing outside the binary. Later critics pointed out that even this perceived non-identity was still framed and understood in relation to the very binary it supposedly escaped. It couldn't fully get outside that framework.
Even the challenge reinforces the norm in a way. Okay, that leads us quite neatly to Monique Wittig, who takes things even further. She argues for abolishing sex as a category altogether.
Wittig is incredibly radical, yeah. Her core argument is that sex, the male-female binary, is not natural or biological in any meaningful sense. It's purely a political and social construct.
Imposed by what she calls compulsory heterosexuality.
Exactly. That's the key mechanism for Wittig. The entire system of dividing people into men and women exists, she argues, solely to uphold and enforce heterosexuality as the mandatory norm.
And language is crucial here for her.
Absolutely central. Wittig believes that the very act of linguistically discriminating sex, constantly naming and dividing people as male or female, is what locks the heterosexual system in place.
So the category woman, for instance,
Only exists within that heterosexual framework, defined in opposition to man. Take away the compulsory heterosexual relationship, she asks, and what does woman even mean?
which leads to her famous and pretty provocative claim that a lesbian is not a woman. What's the thinking there?
Well, for Wittig, if woman is defined by her relationship to man within the heterosexual system, then a lesbian, by definition, stands outside that system. She's not participating in that defining relationship.
So she steps outside the binary.
In Wittig's view, yes. She transcends the category of sex itself because that category only has meaning within the heterosexual matrix. A lesbian is beyond sex as a political designation. She's refusing the terms.
Wow. That is a radical position. And her strategy for change is equally radical, focusing on language.
Yes, linguistic subversion is everything. Since she believes language literally creates the socially real, The only way to dismantle the political category of sex is to fundamentally transform language
Oh.
by refusing to use gendered categories, by assuming a universal speaking position, the I, that isn't marked by sex. In her fiction, she experiments with this, trying to imagine a world and a language where sex categories are obsolete. She famously used elle in French as a potential universal pronoun. It's about attacking the linguistic root of the system.
So changing the words changes the reality. But like Kristeva, are there potential critiques or limitations noted in the sources?
There are. One major question is whether we can truly just step outside or dismantle a system that's so deeply embedded in, well, everything, our language, our institutions, our bodies even. Is it possible to simply refuse these categories when the world constantly imposes them?
And does focusing solely on abolishing sex categories risk overlooking the lived experiences of people navigating those categories now, or the complexities of how individuals relate to gender identity?
Exactly. Those are some of the tensions pointed out. It's a powerful vision, but its practical application raises questions.
These are such distinct, powerful frameworks. So let's bring Judith Butler back in now. We've seen how she engages with Kristeva and Foucault. How does she synthesize or build upon these ideas?
Butler definitely builds heavily on Foucault, particularly his deconstruction of sex and the idea of performativity, but she pushes it further. Butler argues that it's not just gender that's performative, but that the very appearance of a stable, natural sex is also an effect of repeated gender performances. There isn't some pre-existing sex dictating gender. Rather, the relentless performance of gender creates the illusion of a coherent underlying sex.
So the performance comes first, in a way.
Or rather, the repetition of the performance constitutes the sense of an underlying identity or sex. It solidifies it over time.
And drag is important for Butler, too, but maybe with a slightly different emphasis than Foucault.
Yes. While Foucault might see drag revealing the contingency of gender, Butler emphasizes how drag exposes the fundamentally imitative structure of all gender. Meaning that gender isn't about expressing an original identity, whether male or female. It's always about imitating norms, citing previous examples of what man or woman is supposed to look like or act like. Drag just makes this imitation explicit, showing there's no original copy, only copies of copies.
That's a mind-bender. And we already touched on her critiques of Kristeva.
Right, the reliance on the pre-cultural maternal, and especially the pathologization of homosexuality. Butler sees this as deeply problematic, arguing it shores up the heterosexual matrix.
That framework assuming coherence between sex, gender, and desire.
Exactly. Butler asks why deviation from that assumed coherence should be seen as pathological rather than just different. A different way of organizing desire and identity.
And Butler definitely sides with Foucault on incorporation over internalization for how gender works.
Absolutely. Gender isn't just in the head, it's materialized on and through the body via repeated, socially constrained performances. It's about what we do and how that doing creates the effect of being a certain gender.
And regarding Kristeva's semiotic subversion, Butler seems more skeptical about its transformative power.
Yes, echoing some of the other critiques, the Butlerian perspective tends to see Kristeva's semiotic eruptions as ultimately contained within the symbolic order. They might offer temporary disruptions, moments of poetic resistance, but they don't fundamentally challenge the underlying structure of the paternal law or the heterosexual matrix in the way that, say, challenging the performative basis of gender itself might.
Okay, so trying to sort of wrap this up. We have these contrasting views. Kristeva sees potential change bubbling up from within language and culture via the semiotic.
Right, localized disruptions.
Foucault highlights how power constructs sex-gender and suggests subversion lies in practices that expose or trouble those constructions, like drag, perhaps.
Disrupting the norms, revealing their contingency.
And Wittig calls for a much more radical break, abolishing the category of sex entirely, mainly through linguistic revolution.
A complete overhaul of the system's foundations.
And they differ on the body, too. Kristeva's pre-cultural, maternal, Foucault's inscribed surface, Wittig's political construct to be dismantled.
And on homosexuality, Kristeva's problematic pathologizing view versus Wittig's idea of the lesbian as radically outside the system. And their ideas about language and subjectivity are fundamentally different across the board.
It's really striking how all these theories relentlessly chip away at the idea of fixed natural identities. They force us to see the immense power of language, social structures, power dynamics, and just our own repeated actions in shaping how we understand something as fundamental as gender and sexuality.
It leaves us with a really provocative question to mull over, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How might internalizing these ideas, even just playing with them, shift your own understanding of identity?
Yeah, think about those categories we take for granted, the ones that feel so natural. What if they're actually the product of these ongoing social and linguistic processes constantly being made and remade?
What does it mean if gender isn't some deep internal essence, but more like a script we're constantly performing, sometimes imperfectly, sometimes parodically? What are the implications of that?
A lot to think about. We hope this deep dive has given you some new tools, maybe some challenging perspectives, for thinking through these really vital aspects of who we are and how our world is structured.